Have you ever wondered what truly shapes a nation stretched like a narrow ribbon between mountains and sea, where eternal ice in the south meets the driest desert on earth in the north? Chile, a land of harsh contrasts and hidden histories, has been molded by stories not everyone knows. In this video, we will uncover the complete journey of Chile, from ancient indigenous cultures through conquests and dictatorships, to a modern democracy still searching for justice and truth. Long before maps gave it borders and flags gave it colors, the land we now call Chile was already alive. Not with cities or armies, but with voices carried by the wind from the Andes to the Pacific. The towering mountains, with their snow caps glowing in the morning sun, stood as silent witnesses to millennia of human presence. Valleys where rivers cut deep into the earth became home to hunters, gatherers, and later, skilled farmers who learned to coax life from even the most stubborn soil. In the far north, in the shadow of the Atacama desert, the Aymara people tended terraced fields, drawing water from intricate irrigation systems that seemed impossible in such arid lands. They traded with communities across the Andes, exchanging copper, textiles, and dried fish. Far to the south, on the windswept plains and forests, the Mapuche cultivated maize and potatoes while mastering the art of weaving and woodwork. Their spiritual life was intertwined with nature. Rivers, mountains, and the moon itself were not just elements, but living beings, deserving respect and ritual. Archaeological traces tell us this land's story stretches deep into prehistory. The Chinchorro people, who lived along the coast more than 7,000 years ago, practiced the world's earliest known mummification, centuries before the Egyptians. Their preserved remains, wrapped in clay and reeds, speak of a culture that honored the dead as fiercely as it fed the living. These early societies adapted to extremes, from the ice fields of Patagonia to the salt flats of the north, not by conquering nature, but by forming a fragile alliance with it. By the time the first Europeans would arrive, Chile was already a mosaic of cultures, each with its own language, governance, and vision of the world. The Mapuche, in particular, had a warrior tradition and a fierce independence that would soon prove decisive. They fought not to expand their territory, but to preserve it. Oral histories recall leaders who rose in times of crisis, guiding their people through droughts, invasions, and disputes without the need for written laws. Yet these communities were not isolated. Networks of exchange carried not just goods, but ideas, farming techniques, religious symbols, even musical instruments. Across the Andes, the Inca Empire pressed southward in the late 15th century, extending its influence into the Aymara highlands and parts of central Chile. But the Inca never fully subdued the Mapuche. Battles in the rugged Bio River region marked a frontier the empire could not cross. This was the Chile that awaited the arrival of Europeans, a land already rich in human history, where cultures had adapted to some of the most extreme environments on the planet. It was a land with no single ruler, no unified kingdom, only a tapestry of peoples bound together by the landscapes they called home. What came next would test the endurance of those bonds as a new power, armed with steel, gunpowder, and an unyielding sense of destiny, set its sights on this strip of land between mountain and sea. The year was 1541, when Spanish boots first pressed into the soil of the Central Valley. But the story began a few years earlier, far north in the Viceroyalty of Peru. Spain's empire, swollen with silver and ambition, looked southward. The conquistador, Pedro de Valdivia, a man hardened in Europe's wars and seasoned under Francisco Pizarro's campaigns, set out with fewer than 200 men. They marched through deserts and over mountains, chasing rumors of fertile lands and gold. What they found was not a docile frontier awaiting conquest, but a patchwork of fiercely independent peoples. especially the Mapuche. To the Spaniards, this was Terra Nueva, a blank page to be claimed. To the Mapuche, Aymara, and other groups, these were their ancestral lands, soaked with generations of labor, stories, and blood. Valdivia founded Santiago on February 12, 1541, in a valley where the Mapocho River ran cold and clear from the Andes. The city's plan, a grid of streets around a central plaza, was a stamp of empire, an imported order imposed on foreign soil. At first, it was little more than a cluster of wooden houses and a crude fort. But behind its walls, the Spanish brought two weapons more powerful than their steel: the cross and the encomienda. The cross came with missionaries, tasked with converting native peoples to Catholicism. For some, conversion was survival. For others, it was the erasure of gods and traditions that had sustained them for centuries. The encomienda system granted Spanish settlers the right to exact tribute and labor from indigenous communities in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, it was a form of enslavement, breaking apart social structures and tethering native labor to colonial wealth. The Mapuche, however, refused to be absorbed. They harried Spanish outposts, ambushed patrols, and destroyed supply lines. Within months of Santiago's founding, a Mapuche-led force under the woman leader Michimalonco attacked, burning much of the settlement to the ground. Valdivia rebuilt, but the message was clear. This was no simple conquest. The early years of Spanish presence in Chile were defined by a tension that would never fully resolve: the imposition of European order onto a land that resisted at every turn. Expeditions pushed southward, carving out fragile towns that were often abandoned or destroyed under the weight of resistance. In the north, the Spanish expanded into Aymara territories, incorporating them into colonial networks tied to Peru. Valdivia's ambitions were cut short in 1553, when he was captured during a Mapuche uprising led by the young war leader Lautaro, a former page in Valdivia's own household who had learned the Spaniards' tactics and turned them against him. Valdivia's death was not the end of Spanish expansion, but it marked the beginning of a war that would span centuries, known as the Arauco War. Chile's colonial story began not as a swift conquest, but as a grinding stalemate between two visions of the land. One that saw it as a resource to be mined, the other as a homeland to be defended at any cost. In the decades after Pedro de Valdivia's death, the Spanish crown tightened its grip on Chile, not through swift domination, but through a slow, grinding process of settlement, extraction, and subjugation. The colony became a distant, often overlooked frontier of the vast viceroyalty of Peru. It produced no vast silver mines like Potosi, no easy wealth to rival Mexico. But it yielded something the empire still valued: land to farm, rivers to divert, and a labor force to exploit. The machinery of empire ran on the encomienda system. Native communities were parceled out to Spanish settlers as if they were livestock, bound by royal decrees that claimed to protect them while binding them to endless labor. Men were sent to till the fields, women to weave and cook, children to carry water and tend animals. In return, they were expected to abandon their ancestral gods and submit to the Catholic faith. Mission churches rose in the heart of indigenous villages, their bells calling not just to prayer, but to the new rhythms of colonial life. Gold and silver were scarce in central Chile, but in the south, streams were panned and riverbeds dug in search of precious metal. Those who toiled in the mines did so under brutal conditions, their lungs filling with dust, their hands raw from cold water. Meanwhile, the fertile valleys became the backbone of colonial agriculture, supplying wheat not only to local settlements, but also for export to Peru. But the Spanish never fully controlled their southern frontier. Beyond the Bio River, the Mapuche held firm. The Arauco War, already decades old, settled into a grim pattern. Spanish expeditions ventured south to build forts and claim territory, only to be met with fierce raids that burned crops, destroyed outposts, and captured settlers. In the spaces between battles, uneasy truces were negotiated, temporary and fragile, like glass over a fire. To defend their settlements, the Spanish militarized life along the frontier. Every male settler was expected to bear arms. Fortresses dotted the landscape, their wooden palisades bristling with pikes. Supply lines from Santiago were lifelines. To lose them was to starve. In these years, the colony became less a place of opportunity and more a place of endurance. Cultural transformation moved in both directions. While missionaries worked to eradicate native religions, some elements of Mapuche life seeped into the colonial world. Their horsemanship, their knowledge of the land, even their words. Yet the underlying structure was one of inequality so deep, it seemed part of the landscape itself. Spanish settlers sat atop a rigid hierarchy, mestizos filled the middle, and indigenous people labored at the bottom, their autonomy stripped away, except in those pockets where resistance still burned. By the late 16th century, Chile was no longer a blank page in the imperial ledger, but it remained an unfinished chapter. A frontier where the cross and the sword could impose order only within the narrow confines of fortified towns, and where the land beyond remained stubbornly free. The Arauco War was not a single conflict, but a long, jagged scar running through more than 3 centuries of Chilean history. It began in the mid-1500s with the first Spanish push into Mapuche territory, and did not truly fade until the late 19th century, when Chile's modern army finally marched south in the so-called pacification of Araucanía. In between lay a cycle of violence, negotiation, betrayal, and renewed bloodshed that neither side could fully escape. To the Spanish, the Mapuche resistance was a military problem to be solved, a matter of forts, soldiers, and supply lines. To the Mapuche, it was a question of survival. Their lands, rivers, and forests were not mere property. They were the bones and breath of their identity. Losing them would mean not just defeat, but the end of their way of life. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Mapuche leaders such as Lautaro, Caupolicán, and later Pelantaro became symbols of defiance. They were not kings or emperors, but war chiefs chosen in councils, leading through charisma, tactical skill, and an unshakable commitment to autonomy. Using guerrilla tactics, they struck forts under cover of darkness, cut off Spanish communications, and vanished into the dense forests and mountains. The Spanish adapted in turn, establishing a chain of fortified towns along the frontier. Yet each fort was a vulnerable island in a hostile sea. Supply caravans risked ambush. Settlers lived with the constant awareness that the night could bring fire and death. Some governors turned to diplomacy, negotiating parlamentos, formal councils where both sides exchanged gifts, shared food, and agreed to temporary boundaries. These truces brought short periods of peace, but they were fragile. A single insult, a raid, or a broken promise could shatter them overnight. Religion was another battlefield. Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries ventured deep into Mapuche territory, building missions and teaching Catholic doctrine. Some conversions were genuine. Others were acts of calculated compliance, a shield against Spanish retaliation. Still, many Mapuche clung to their ancestral beliefs, incorporating elements of Christianity without surrendering their spiritual core. For generations, the Bio River became the symbolic and literal frontier. North of it lay the Spanish domain, where colonial society grew, towns, haciendas, and churches multiplying under the weight of imperial order. South of it, the Mapuche world remained defiantly autonomous, its political and military structures evolving to meet each new challenge. This enduring stalemate shaped Chile's identity in ways the Spanish never intended. It created a frontier culture that was militarized, wary, and marked by mutual knowledge. Enemies who understood each other's strengths too well to underestimate them. It also bred a certain respect, even in conflict. Mapuche leaders and Spanish governors sometimes toasted one another at peace councils before returning to their opposing camps. By the 18th century, the war had become part of the landscape, as constant as the mountains. And though the Spanish crown continued to pour soldiers and silver into the effort, it was clear that conquest in Chile would never be absolute. The Mapuche, like the land itself, refused to be subdued. By the early 19th century, the Spanish Empire was no longer the unshakable force it had once seemed. Decades of costly wars in Europe, colonial uprisings abroad, and the slow decay of its own institutions had weakened the crown's grasp on its far-flung territories. In Chile, the signs were subtle at first. A shortage of troops along the frontier, governors struggling to enforce decrees, taxes rising to pay for wars fought an ocean away. But beneath the surface, a restless current was beginning to move. The spark came from across the Atlantic. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, capturing King Ferdinand VII and placing his brother Joseph on the throne. The legitimacy of Spanish rule was suddenly in question. Across the Americas, local elites, the criollos, descendants of Spaniards born in the colonies, began to ask dangerous questions. If the king was gone, to whom did they owe their loyalty? And if Spain was in chaos, might it be time to govern themselves? Chile was still a peripheral colony, a long, thin strip at the edge of the empire. But ideas travel faster than armies. News from Buenos Aires, Caracas, and Bogotá filtered in through merchant ships and whispered letters. Pamphlets circulated, speaking of liberty, sovereignty, and the rights of man. Concepts born in the Enlightenment and carried by the revolutions in North America and France. The criollos of Santiago and other towns saw opportunity in Spain's weakness. Many were frustrated by the rigid social hierarchy that placed them below peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, in matters of power and privilege. They were educated, wealthy from agriculture and trade, but politically sidelined. For them, independence was not only about breaking free from Spain, it was about stepping into positions of authority long denied to them. Yet the path forward was not simple. Chile's population was deeply divided. Some feared that breaking with Spain would bring chaos, threatening property, trade, and the fragile stability of the colony. Others, especially in rural areas and among indigenous communities, saw little reason to exchange one ruling elite for another. The first organized steps toward autonomy came cautiously. In September 1810, local leaders formed the Primera Junta Nacional de Gobierno in Santiago, declaring that they would govern Chile in the name of the imprisoned King Ferdinand VII until he could return. It was a political maneuver wrapped in loyalty, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Chileans were taking their first steps towards self-rule. Still, the Spanish crown had not truly lost its grip. Loyalist forces remained, and the viceroyalty of Peru to the north, still firmly under royal control, would serve as a staging ground for military efforts to pull Chile back into line. The fragile experiment of the junta would soon be tested on the battlefield, and the question would shift from whether Chile could govern itself to whether it could survive the attempt. The Primera Junta Nacional de Gobierno of 1810 was born in cautious optimism. It claimed loyalty to the imprisoned King Ferdinand VII. but its very existence suggested a different truth. Chile's criollo elite had tasted the idea of self-rule, and it would not be easily surrendered. For the next 4 years, the colony lived in a fragile state of duality, still tied to Spain in name, yet inching toward independence in practice. The early movement was led by figures like Juan Martínez de Rosas and José Miguel Carrera, men of education, wealth, and ambition. They pushed reforms aimed at loosening the colonial grip, opening ports to trade beyond Spain, raising local militias, and establishing a national congress. Newspapers flourished, spreading political debate to a wider public than ever before. In the plazas of Santiago, the air was thick with speeches, arguments, and a new kind of hope. But hope was fragile, and unity elusive. Factions emerged among the patriots. Moderates who favored gradual reform versus radicals who demanded immediate separation from Spain. Personal rivalries, especially between Carrera and Bernardo O'Higgins, deepened the divides. These fractures would become dangerous once the Spanish crown moved to reclaim control. By 1814, loyalist forces from the Viceroyalty of Peru were advancing south to crush the fledgling movement. The patriots, though brave, were inexperienced in large-scale warfare. They met the Spanish at Rancagua in October 1814, a town that would become a graveyard for Chile's first bid for freedom. The Battle of Rancagua lasted 2 days, fought in choking smoke and the stench of burning buildings. O'Higgins, commanding the Patriot forces, refused to retreat despite being surrounded. His men fought with bayonets when ammunition ran out, defending barricades until the streets ran red. Civilians were trapped in their homes, caught between collapsing walls and stray musket fire. By the battle's end, the town was a smoldering ruin. The Patriots had been crushed. Defeat brought more than military loss. It ushered in a period known as the Reconquista, when Spanish rule returned with a vengeance. Leaders of the independence movement were executed or forced into exile, their supporters hunted, their families harassed. The press was silenced, militias disbanded, and Santiago fell under the shadow of martial law. Yet the flame of independence did not die. Many of the surviving patriots fled across the Andes into Argentina, where they regrouped and plotted their return. The defeat at Rancagua became not a final chapter, but a bitter lesson in the cost of disunity. If Chile was to win its freedom, it would need more than brave speeches and scattered militias. It would need a professional army, a unified command, and a strategy as bold as the mountains themselves. Far to the east, in the plains of Mendoza, that army was already beginning to take shape. And when it came back across the Andes, it would change the fate of Chile forever. In the wake of Rancagua's ruin, Chile's hope for independence lay not within its borders, but across the Andes in exile. Bernardo O'Higgins and other surviving patriots found refuge in the Argentine province of Mendoza, where they joined forces with an already legendary figure, José de San Martín. San Martín, an Argentine general and veteran of the wars in Europe, understood that the fight for independence in South America was not a collection of separate struggles, but a single, interconnected war. To free Chile, and eventually Peru, they would have to do what seemed impossible: lead an army over the towering spine of the Andes in the dead of summer. The plan was audacious, even reckless. The Andes were no ordinary mountains. They were a wall of ice and stone, with peaks soaring over 6,000 meters, thin air that stole the breath, and passes that could freeze a man solid overnight. The Army of the Andes, as it came to be known, was a mix of battle-hardened veterans, raw recruits, and exiled Chileans burning for revenge. They brought with them artillery, ammunition, food, and even printing presses. All of it hauled by mules and oxen up narrow, snowbound paths. In January 1817, they began the crossing. Men collapsed from exhaustion, animals slipped into ravines, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Yet the army pressed on, driven by a singular conviction. On the other side lay the chance to break Spain's hold on Chile once and for all. Emerging from the mountains, the Patriots descended into the Central Valley like a storm. The Spanish forces, confident that the Andes would serve as an impenetrable barrier, were caught off guard. On February 12, 1817, the two sides met at the Battle of Chacabuco. It was a swift, decisive victory for the Patriots. The Royalist army, unprepared and outmaneuvered, crumbled under the assault. Santiago fell soon after, and O'Higgins was named Supreme Director of Chile. For the first time since 1810, the Patriots held the capital. But the war was far from over. The Spanish regrouped, launching a counterattack in 1818. At Cancha Rayada, they dealt the Patriots a sharp blow, scattering their forces and threatening to undo all that had been gained. Panic spread through Santiago. Some prepared to flee, but O'Higgins and San Martin rallied their men, calling for one last stand. That stand came on April 5, 1818, at the Battle of Maipú. Under a burning sun, Patriot and Royalist forces clashed in a brutal fight that left thousands dead or wounded. When the smoke cleared, it was the Patriots who stood victorious. The Spanish threat to Chile's independence was broken. Maipú was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a defining moment in Chile's national memory. The day when the impossible crossing of the Andes met the unyielding will for freedom. And yet, independence was not the end of Chile's struggles. It was merely the beginning of the complex task of building a nation from the ashes of war. The victory at Maipú in 1818 secured Chile's independence in name, but the reality of nation building was far more complicated. The new republic emerged from the war battered and indebted, its economy in tatters, its political factions still at odds. Yet the leaders of independent Chile shared a common vision: to transform the country from a vulnerable strip of land into a stable, prosperous state with a voice in the affairs of the Pacific. In the decades that followed, Chile worked to consolidate its institutions. New constitutions were drafted, sometimes imposed by force, as conservative and liberal factions wrestled for dominance. The political atmosphere was tense, but in comparison to many of its neighbors, Chile managed to maintain a degree of stability. This allowed the state to turn its attention outward, to secure its borders and expand its influence. The most significant of these expansions came in the late 19th century with the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1884, a conflict that would redefine the map of South America. The roots of the war lay in the Atacama Desert, a barren, sun-bleached expanse that, beneath its lifeless surface, held immense deposits of nitrate, a mineral essential for fertilizer and explosives, and highly sought after by industrializing nations. At the time, the desert's coastal region was divided between Bolivia and Peru. But Chilean companies, backed by Chilean capital, dominated its exploitation. When Bolivia attempted to raise taxes on a Chilean-owned nitrate company, tensions flared. Chile responded by occupying the Bolivian port of Antofagasta in February 1879. Alliances hardened quickly. Peru, bound to Bolivia by a secret defense pact, entered the war against Chile. What began as a dispute over taxation became a regional war for control of resources. Chile's navy proved decisive. Controlling the sea lanes along the Pacific coast allowed Chilean troops to land deep in enemy territory. The war was marked by brutal campaigns in the desert, where soldiers battled not just the enemy, but thirst, heat, and the endless horizon of sand. Chilean forces captured key territories, including the Bolivian coast and Peru's Tarapacá and Arica provinces. In 1881, they marched into Lima itself. The Treaty of Ancón in 1883 and subsequent agreements confirmed Chile's control over the nitrate-rich territories. Bolivia lost its coastline, becoming landlocked, a wound that still shapes its national identity, and Peru ceded valuable provinces. For Chile, the war was a triumph that brought wealth and strategic security. The nitrate boom fueled an economic golden age, filling government coffers and financing public works. But victory carried its own shadows. The dependence on nitrate exports tied Chile's prosperity to volatile global markets. And the expansion of territory brought new challenges in governing diverse populations, including indigenous communities who had little say in the new order. The War of the Pacific cemented Chile's reputation as a formidable regional power, but it also deepened the nation's reliance on resources drawn from the land. A pattern that would repeat itself, with both promise and peril, in the century to come. In the years after the War of the Pacific, Chile entered what many at the time saw as a golden era. The nitrate-rich territories of the Atacama, pried from Bolivia and Peru, poured unprecedented wealth into the national treasury. This white gold, saltpeter, became Chile's lifeblood. Ships left the ports of Iquique and Antofagasta loaded with sacks of the mineral, bound for Europe, North America, and beyond. From fertilizer for crops to explosives for mines and armies, nitrate fed the demands of an industrializing world, and Chile, for the first time, stood at the center of a global market. The profits transformed Santiago and Valparaiso. Elegant buildings rose in neoclassical style. Boulevards were widened, and electric lights illuminated the capital's streets. The state financed railroads, stretching deep into the desert to carry nitrate to the ports, and public works projects promised to modernize the young republic. For the ruling elite, it seemed as though Chile had stepped into a new age of prosperity and power. But the boom was uneven. The nitrate pampas were harsh, sun-scorched expanses where workers toiled under brutal conditions. Laborers, many of them migrants from southern Chile and even from abroad, lived in isolated company towns, their lives controlled by the nitrate firms. Wages were often paid in tokens redeemable only at company stores, where prices were high and goods limited. Accidents in the mines and processing plants were common, and the desert's heat and dust took a toll on health. The wealth from nitrate flowed upward, enriching landowners, industrialists, and foreign investors, many from Britain, whose capital dominated the industry. Little of it reached the working class. The gulf between rich and poor widened, and discontent began to simmer. By the early 20th century, this discontent found its voice. Workers organized strikes demanding better pay, safer conditions, and an end to payment in company tokens. In 1907, a massive strike in Iquique brought thousands of nitrate workers and their families into the city. They gathered at the Santa Maria school, seeking negotiations with the government. Instead, the army surrounded the school and opened fire. Hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, were killed in what became known as the Santa Maria School Massacre. The event shocked the nation and cast a long shadow over Chile's nitrate boom. It revealed the fragile foundations of prosperity built on exploitation and repression. Still, the industry continued to dominate the economy, its profits funding the state and its politics. The end came suddenly. In the 1920s, the invention of synthetic fertilizers in Europe shattered the market for natural nitrate. Prices collapsed, mines closed, and the company towns that had once bustled with life fell silent. The white gold had run dry, and with it went the illusion of endless growth. Chile now faced a new challenge: to survive without the resource that had defined its fortunes for nearly half a century. The collapse of the nitrate industry in the 1920s struck Chile like a sudden winter storm, sharp, disorienting, and leaving little untouched. Government revenues plunged, unemployment surged, and entire communities in the north, once sustained by the nitrate trade, emptied almost overnight. The crisis exposed the fragility of an economy built on a single resource, and with it came a reckoning. Chile could no longer depend on one mineral to secure its future. The early 20th century was already a period of social and political ferment. Industrialization in Santiago, Valparaiso, and other cities had drawn thousands from the countryside, creating a growing urban working class. They lived in crowded conventillos, tenement houses where families packed into single rooms, sharing water pumps and outdoor latrines. Diseases spread easily, wages were low, and jobs were insecure. The gulf between the elite and the poor, long wide, now seemed unbridgeable. Labor unions gained strength, inspired by socialist, anarchist, and communist movements abroad. They organized strikes and protests, demanding not only higher pay, but also shorter workdays, safer workplaces, and basic social protections. In response, the government oscillated between concession and crackdown, passing labor laws while sending police and soldiers to break up demonstrations. The political scene mirrored the turbulence on the streets. The parliamentary system, dominated by an entrenched elite, struggled to respond to the demands of a changing society. Corruption and inefficiency eroded public trust. In 1920, Arturo Alessandri was elected president on a wave of populist support, promising sweeping reforms to address inequality and improve living conditions. His rhetoric earned him the nickname El León de Tarapacá, the Lion of Tarapacá. But he faced fierce resistance from Congress and the conservative oligarchy. Frustrated with the slow pace of change, sectors of the military intervened in politics, staging coups and counter-coups that further destabilized the country. Alessandri himself was forced into exile in 1924, only to be recalled the following year. Amid this chaos, a new constitution was enacted in 1925, designed to strengthen the presidency and reduce the dominance of parliament. It also enshrined certain social rights, including protections for workers, on paper at least. Still, progress was uneven. The reforms were undermined by the global economic collapse of the Great Depression in 1929. Chile, heavily dependent on exports of copper and other raw materials, saw its markets dry up. Poverty deepened, and political instability worsened. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession, and the military continued to wield significant influence behind the scenes. Yet, in the cracks of this instability, seeds of a modern Chile were sown. State involvement in the economy expanded, public education grew, and social legislation slowly took root. The working class had forced itself into the national conversation, and the idea that the state bore responsibility for the welfare of its people, once radical, was now part of the political landscape. Chile was still far from the democratic stability it would one day claim, but the first steps had been taken. The struggle ahead would be as much about defining who held power as about deciding how that power would be used. By the late 1960s, Chile was a nation caught between promise and fracture. Its democratic tradition was real, one of the most stable in Latin America, but so too was its inequality. Land ownership remained concentrated in the hands of a few. Industry was dominated by foreign companies, and the gap between the wealthy elite and the rural poor seemed unbridgeable. Amid Cold War tensions, Chile's politics polarized sharply. The right warned of creeping socialism, the left called for revolution, and the center struggled to hold the middle ground. In 1970, Chileans made a choice that stunned the world. Salvador Allende, a physician and lifelong Marxist, won the presidency, the first time a self-declared Marxist had come to power through democratic elections in the Western Hemisphere. His victory was narrow, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. For supporters, Allende represented the possibility of building socialism without abandoning democracy. For opponents, he was a threat to property, stability, and alignment with the United States. Allende's program, called the Unidad Popular, Popular Unity, was ambitious. It aimed to nationalize Chile's copper mines, the salary of Chile, most of which were controlled by U.S. corporations. He pushed sweeping agrarian reform to redistribute land to peasants, expanded social welfare programs, increased wages, and froze prices on basic goods. In the short term, these measures were popular among workers and the poor. For the first time, many felt the state was truly acting on their behalf. But the changes came at a cost. Landowners resisted redistribution, sometimes violently. Industrialists slowed production or closed factories. The United States, viewing Allende's experiment as a dangerous precedent for the hemisphere, applied economic pressure. Loans were cut, aid was withdrawn, and covert operations were launched to make the economy scream, as declassified documents would later reveal. Economic strains deepened quickly. Shortages of basic goods appeared, worsened by black market hoarding and political sabotage. Inflation surged. Strikes spread, not just from workers demanding more, but also from middle-class sectors fearful of losing what they had. The polarization hardened. Political debate turned into street clashes, and trust in democratic compromise eroded. Still, Allende pressed forward, believing that history was on his side. In his speeches, he spoke of Chile as a beacon for the developing world, proof that socialism could be built at the ballot box. But his political base was fragile, and the opposition was relentless. By 1973, the tension was palpable. The country was divided into two irreconcilable camps, each seeing the other not as opponents, but as existential threats. In the middle stood a democratic system strained to breaking. The armed forces, long aloof from politics, began to stir. Generals who once pledged loyalty to the Constitution now whispered in private about intervention. On the horizon, a storm was gathering. One that would not only sweep away Allende's government, but also usher in one of the darkest chapters in Chile's modern history. The morning of September 11th, 1973, broke cold and tense over Santiago. Rumors had swirled for weeks, but few could imagine the full weight of what was coming. Tanks rolled into the capital, soldiers fanned out across strategic points, and the Navy seized the port city of Valparaiso. Overhead, Hawker Hunter jets circled, not as symbols of national defense, but as instruments of an internal war. The armed forces, led by General Augusto Pinochet, had decided to end Salvador Allende's presidency by force. La Moneda, the presidential palace, became the epicenter. Allende, refusing offers to flee, donned a helmet and shouldered an AK-47, a gift from Fidel Castro, and addressed the nation one last time over the radio. His voice was steady, even as artillery fire echoed through the streets. He spoke of betrayal, of his faith in Chile's destiny, and of his refusal to resign. "I will not step down," he said, "and I will pay for loyalty to the people with my life." By late morning, the jets dove. Rockets tore into the palace roof, shattering windows and igniting fires. Smoke billowed into the winter sky. Inside, Allende and a small circle of loyalists fought until the halls filled with heat and choking ash. When soldiers finally entered, Allende was dead, officially by his own hand, though debates over the exact moment and manner of his death would echo for decades. The coup was swift, but its aftermath would stretch across 17 years. The military junta, with Pinochet at its head, dissolved Congress, suspended the Constitution, banned political parties, and imposed a strict curfew. Thousands of suspected leftists, politicians, union leaders, students were arrested. Many were sent to makeshift detention centers, stadiums turned into prisons, or remote camps in the desert. Some were tortured, others simply disappeared, leaving their families with no grave to visit. The repression was systematic. Secret police agencies like the DINA hunted dissidents, operating both within Chile and beyond its borders as part of Operation Condor, a network of South American dictatorships exchanging intelligence and eliminating opponents. Fear became part of daily life, neighbors whispering, phones tapped, letters opened before they reached their recipients. Yet alongside this machinery of terror, the regime embarked on a radical economic transformation. Guided by economists trained at the University of Chicago, the so-called Chicago Boys, Pinochet privatized state industries, slashed public spending, and opened Chile's markets to foreign investment. Supporters hailed the resulting growth as the Chilean miracle. Critics countered that the benefits flowed mainly to the wealthy, while unemployment, poverty, and inequality soared in the early years. For many Chileans, the 1973 coup was more than the end of Allende's government. It was the shattering of a belief that democracy could withstand its deepest divisions. The memory of that day, and the long shadow it cast, would linger well after the guns fell silent and the smoke over La Moneda dispersed into the Andean wind. By the mid-1980s, General Augusto Pinochet's rule seemed immovable. The 1980 Constitution, drafted under military oversight and approved in a tightly controlled plebiscite, had cemented his position. It promised a transition to democracy, but on the regime's terms. The document granted Pinochet 8 more years as president before a national vote in 1988 would decide whether he would serve another term. It also entrenched military influence, ensuring that even in a future democracy, the armed forces would retain significant power. Yet beneath the surface of control, resistance was growing. Economic crises in the early 1980s, triggered by debt, falling copper prices, and the fragility of Chile's free market model, fueled public discontent. Unemployment soared, and the social safety nets dismantled in the 1970s left many with nowhere to turn. In working-class neighborhoods, soup kitchens emerged. In universities, students marched. In the countryside, priests and human rights activists documented abuses. Mass protests began to shake Santiago and other cities. Known as Jornadas de Protesta Nacional, National Protest Days, these demonstrations combined strikes, marches, and nightly cacerolazos, the rhythmic clanging of pots and pans echoing from apartment balconies. The government responded with tear gas, water cannons, and live ammunition. Still, the protests returned month after month, a drumbeat that even Pinochet's iron grip could not silence. International pressure mounted as well. Reports of torture, disappearances, and political repression drew condemnation from human rights organizations, foreign governments, and the United Nations. Chile's isolation deepened, and its economy remained fragile. Pinochet's aura of invincibility began to crack. The opposition, long fragmented, found unity in the looming 1988 plebiscite. The vote was simple: yes, to extend Pinochet's rule for another 8 years, or no, to end it and trigger open presidential elections. The No campaign brought together a wide coalition. Socialists, centrists, conservatives disillusioned with the regime, and thousands of ordinary citizens who had lived under dictatorship for 15 years. Their campaign was cautious but creative. Instead of focusing solely on the regime's brutality, they offered a vision of a democratic Chile, hopeful, inclusive, and safe. Colorful television spots featured smiling families, music, and the slogan, La alegría ya viene. Joy is coming. It was a direct contrast to the regime's grim warnings that a no vote would bring chaos. On October 5, 1988, Chileans went to the polls under the watchful eye of the military. When the results came in, the no had won with 55% of the vote. It was a peaceful but monumental turning point, proof that even under authoritarian rule, the ballot could still carry the weight of history. Pinochet, bound by his own constitution, accepted the result. Presidential elections followed in 1989, and in March 1990, Patricio Aylwin was sworn in as the first democratic president since Allende. The transition was cautious, negotiated, and incomplete. The military retained influence, and the 1980 Constitution remained in force. Yet for the first time in 17 years, Chileans could speak openly, vote freely, and imagine a future not dictated by fear. The return to democracy in 1990 ushered in an era of optimism. Chile's leaders embraced a model of economic liberalization combined with gradual social reform. Exports, especially copper, surged. Foreign investment poured in, and poverty rates fell dramatically over the next 2 decades. Santiago's skyline grew taller, its streets more crowded with cars and commerce. Internationally, Chile was hailed as a success story, the Jaguar of Latin America, a nation that had weathered dictatorship and emerged as a model of stability. Yet beneath the glass towers and macroeconomic statistics, deep inequalities persisted. While the GDP grew, so did the concentration of wealth. Public education remained underfunded. Healthcare access was uneven, and pension reforms from the Pinochet era left many retirees struggling to survive. The Constitution of 1980, a relic of military rule, still shaped the political system, limiting the pace and scope of reform. For years, these tensions simmered, visible in occasional strikes and student protests. In 2006, high school students, later called the Penguin Revolution for their black and white uniforms, flooded the streets demanding free, quality education. In 2011, university students led massive demonstrations, calling attention to a system that left graduates with heavy debts and unequal opportunities. The protests brought education to the forefront of national politics. But the structural roots of inequality went deeper. By the late 2010s, frustration had spread beyond the classrooms. Rising costs of living, stagnant wages, and privatized utilities, from water to electricity, fueled a sense that the economic model, while successful on paper, was failing ordinary Chileans. The spark came in October 2019, when a modest subway fare increase in Santiago triggered a wave of demonstrations. What began as fare-dodging student protests escalated into a nationwide uprising. Millions marched, chanting, "No son 30 pesos, son 30 años." It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. A reference to the decades since democracy's return in which inequality had persisted. The protests were met with a state of emergency, curfews, and the deployment of the military to the streets for the first time since the dictatorship. Reports of excessive force, injuries, and human rights abuses reignited memories of a darker past. In response, the government made a historic concession. Chileans would vote on whether to draft a new constitution to replace the one inherited from Pinochet's era. In October 2020, nearly 80% voted yes. A constitutional convention was elected, composed equally of men and women, with seats reserved for indigenous representatives. A symbolic break from the centralized, top-down politics of the past. Chile's story, from its ancient indigenous cultures to its modern streets filled with protest, is stitched together by threads of endurance. It is a land of vast contrasts, glaciers and deserts, dictatorship and democracy, opulence and poverty. And each contrast has left its mark on the national soul. For all its economic progress, Chile remains haunted by the question of how to reconcile growth with justice, prosperity with equality, and memory with unity. The wounds of the past are neither distant nor fully healed. Families still search for the remains of loved ones who disappeared during the dictatorship. Their photographs carried in silent marches through Santiago's avenues. Memorials and museums, like the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos, stand as both remembrance and warning, preserving testimonies of torture, exile, and resilience. They remind Chileans that history is not something to be neatly filed away, but a living inheritance to confront. At the same time, the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples continue their struggle for recognition, land, and cultural rights. Their demands are not only political, but existential. A call for Chile to embrace all its identities, not just those shaped by European conquest and nation-building. In this, the country faces the challenge of weaving its multiple histories into a shared future. Efforts at reconciliation have been halting, but significant. Truth commissions have documented past abuses. Governments of varying political stripes have issued apologies and enacted reparations. Yet these gestures, however sincere, cannot by themselves erase decades of distrust. For many, justice remains incomplete. Trials move slowly, sentences are light, and some perpetrators of past crimes still walk free. And still, Chile endures. Its democracy, while imperfect, has held through corruption scandals, economic downturns, and political polarization. Its people have shown again and again that they will take to the streets when they believe the nation's moral compass has faltered. Whether for education, pensions, indigenous rights, or a new constitution, the act of protest has become part of Chile's civic language. The recent push for constitutional change, turbulent and unfinished, captures the country's current crossroads. It is a reminder that nationhood is not static, but a process, one that demands continual renegotiation between the past and the future, the powerful and the powerless, the memory of injustice and the hope of renewal. Chile is more than its battles and its borders. It is the fishermen of Chiloé, the miners of the Atacama, the students of Santiago, and the elders of Araucanía. It is the hum of the Pacific against its western shore, and the silent peaks of the Andes guarding its eastern frontier. It is a nation that has been broken and rebuilt, wounded and resilient. In the end, the search for truth and justice is not separate from Chile's path to unity. It is the very heart of it, and perhaps that is the hidden truth that has shaped this nation all along. That to move forward, it must keep remembering.